Good morning, Asian patrons of the Vatican Museums, and welcome to this, our final encounter in our lecture series, Raphael and His World, brought to you by Ben Chang and the Asian patrons of the arts in the Vatican Museums. And this lecture will be concentrating on Michelangelo, the might of Michelangelo, and how this artist, 8 years older than Raphael, played such a role in forming and preparing Raphael for the greatness that we saw in the earlier episodes. As a matter of fact, this is a kind of a build-up to the Clash of the Titans, which is where we first started our series, where we saw Michelangelo and Raphael encountering each other in the Vatican Museums in this painting between the Sistine Chapel and the Raphael rooms, or the apartments of Julius II, that would really never leave art the same. But Michelangelo and Raphael had crossed paths earlier back in Florence. And so we're going to see how a young Raphael was so amazed by the art of Michelangelo that it helped form his own style and in many ways prepare him to become Michelangelo's great artistic adversary by the time they got to Rome. So let's go back to Raphael, who, 20 years old, comes to Florence. And to be perfectly honest, when Raphael comes to Florence, he's a pretty gifted kid. He's been painting since he was 9. He's been feted and admired by everybody in his own town of Urbino. And he's traveling with a special letter from the prefettessa, one of the most powerful women in Urbino, to introduce him into artistic circles in Florence. So he must have come to Florence somewhat sure of himself, a kind of a cocky kid ready to show the world what he knew how to do. But he showed up in 1504, exactly when Michelangelo's David was being hauled into place. And that set the stage for some pretty exciting rivalry. Now, Michelangelo had also been born outside of the city of Florence, but he was born within the territory of Florence, so that he was born in a Florentine, unlike Raphael. And the little hometown of Caprese, today known as Caprese Michelangelo for its most famous denizen. As a matter of fact, in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the house, which is preserved today as a museum as the House of Michelangelo. Caprese is where Michelangelo was born in 1475, and not very far from Urbino. So you can see here on this map that it's 60 kilometers between Florence and Caprese. But if you keep going east, it's another 60 kilometers between Florence and Urbino. So basically, Michelangelo is sort of equidistant from both towns. But the birth in Florence changed everything. Because as a Florentine, Michelangelo was the legitimate heir to the grandeur of Florentine art, to the great legacy of Brunelleschi and his dome, of Ghiberti, Donatello, Botticelli, the brilliant painters who had painted all those years there, as well as sculptors, by the way. And even though Raphael grew up in an artistic household, another big difference between the two men, Raphael's father was a painter. Giovanni Sanzio, who we met already in the last episode, was not a very good painter, but made sure that his son was aware of the greatest painters. His father was a busy workshop owner, so Raphael grew up understanding how to run a workshop. Michelangelo was from a kind of nobility fallen on hard times. Their family took government jobs, kind of paid pensions from the government. And so for Michelangelo to go into the world of art production was kind of a step down in his father's eyes. He doesn't come from a family of art producers. And so Michelangelo attributed his great skills in sculpting to the fact that when he was born, he was put out to nurse with the wife of a sculptor. And so he told his biographer, Giorgio Vasari, that what good he has comes from the pure air of Arezzo, which you can see is a town just a little bit south of Caprese, and because I sucked in hammers and chisels with my mother's milk, with my nurse's milk. So this Michelangelo, who's building a kind of mythology for himself. He's already creating the idea of Michelangelo who absorbed his artistic talent almost out of thin air. And as a matter of fact, the story continues of Michelangelo. Michelangelo's youthful biography, told to us by Vasari, but dictated to Vasari by Michelangelo, tells us that he was entered into the studio of Ghirlandaio at the age of 13. Now, Ghirlandaio was a busy painter. We saw him working in the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo's father, bowing to the inevitable, tried to put his son into an environment where someday his son might be a successful businessman running a large studio. But Michelangelo never wanted that. And so he contrived at age 15 to get himself accepted in a charter school begun by Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence in the 1480s, and a man of a family which was famous for art patronage. So Michelangelo goes to this garden where something very special will happen. He will not only be taught how to sculpt by Bertoldo, who was the student or studied under Donatello, but he will also be put into contact with thinkers. In that garden, there will be poets like Polizzano. There'll be theologians and philosophers like Marcello Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. He'll be surrounded by people who help form his mind and his spirit, all the while he's forming his hand. This lovely little sculpture from 1861 by Emilio Zocchi shows young Michelangelo. It's a story that Michelangelo tells from his youth about when he was working on the head of a faun out in the garden, and Lorenzo the Magnificent came out to look over the boy's shoulder. And when Lorenzo saw the work, he laughed and pointed out a few changes Michelangelo could make, which he dutifully made. And Lorenzo was so impressed that he kept a special eye on Michelangelo. And the great artist himself tells us that he used to sit next to the famous figure of Lorenzo every night at dinner. So, to the right of that, we see one of Michelangelo's earliest works. This is a work he probably produced when he was about 16. And it shows already a Raphael grappling with the legacy of Donatello, the last truly brilliantly celebrated sculptor, the individual genius of sculpture in Florence. And Donatello produced a type of sculpting called rilievo schiacciato, and you see Michelangelo experimenting with this kind of technique here. Rilievo schiacciato means flattened relief, so it kind of looks like someone put a rolling pin on top of it to soften it. And what they're looking for in doing this is a type of painting effect. So instead of the relief standing out sort of sharply three-dimensionally against the surface, it has a kind of a softer, more painterly, the drapery of the Virgin falls more softly on her body. And so he's experimenting with this technique. He's looking to follow in the footsteps of Donatello. The other very interesting thing that the Madonna of the Steps shows us is that Michelangelo is already very focused on the human body. He doesn't set the Virgin in some sort of garden. He doesn't carve a naturalistic landscape, which is what Donatello did when he created the rilievo schiacciato. He creates a sharp and uncompromising space of stairs and a bench. And then the bodies fill it and soften it. So instead of using the atmosphere or nature or bushes or shrubs, he uses these soft bodies, John the Baptist on the steps, the little boys along the back, and that beautiful figure of baby Jesus, who has fallen asleep while nursing. And so in one way, it's a very tender scene. And then you have the arm that comes behind his back, which is almost a preview of that poignant arm we will see in the Pietà, which will be carved 9 years later. Another indication of the very single-minded approach to art of Michelangelo is this Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs, which was produced when Michelangelo was 17. It's again a small relief. It's actually a little bit smaller, I think, than the Madonna of the Steps, and it shows a Greek mythological event where this mythic people called the Lapiths, who are humans, had a wedding. and they invited centaurs, which are half human, half horse. During the wedding, during the drinking at the wedding, a fight broke out, and the battle between the Lapiths and the centaurs means we see the half man, half horses fighting these mythological heroic figures. So Michelangelo took on this subject matter because, of course, it was the subject closest to his heart, the dynamic human body. So he takes the space of the stone, and in the space of the stone, leaving almost no space between the figures, very much borrowed from the ancient Roman idea of how they decorate sarcophagi, you have this incredible composition of interlocking figures that are fighting back and forth. The only thing that's funny is that there aren't any horses. And again, he's making a declaration here. He's showing us Michelangelo's specialization will be the human form in myriad poses, but he's not very interested in anything else. As a matter of fact, the only sign of the horse is in the lower left-hand side. So this young man began to get noticed. Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, and Michelangelo had to start to make his way, start to look for clientele, and he was noticed by a figure in Rome whose name was Cardinal Raphael Riario. Cardinal Riario had quite an artistic pedigree. He was the nephew of Sixtus IV, who built the Sistine Chapel, and he was the cousin of Julius II, who would eventually be the one who brought Michelangelo and Raphael to Rome. Now, Raphael Riario was interested in art, but didn't quite have the same forward-looking visionary eye of a patron. So when he heard about the art of Michelangelo, his first thought was this was his opportunity to take a young kid from Florence and be able to produce works of art that would look like ancient Roman works, but without costing the same amount. So he hired young Michelangelo, who was about 21 years old, to do a sculpture of the Bacchus, the god of wine. And Riario was expecting most likely a sculpture that looks a little bit like the one to the right, where you see a classical sculpture. This is a Roman copy of a Greek original. The statue stands in contrapposto, so the one engaged leg carrying the weight, the one freestanding. It's mirrored on the upper body. You see the beautiful proportions of the body. You see the face that's very elegant, gazing off into the distance. Another very typical way to see images of the Bacchus would be on sarcophagi. It's a very popular subject matter for ancient Roman funerary art. And here you have another Bacchus, again, the contrapposto, the beautiful body for the god of wine with the outline musculature of the stomach and the thighs and the chest. And Michelangelo knew both of them, knew the prototypes. He knew what people expected when they asked for a Bacchus, and he produced something different. So even though, yes, it's a classical nude, the more you look at it, the more you realize there's something a little funny. Michelangelo's Bacchus is kind of standing in contrapposto. The back leg is jutted straight, and the front leg is sort of pushed forward, but it doesn't seem to be bearing the weight very confidently. What's more, the shoulders pull backwards, so his body makes a little bit of an arc as his leg reaches forward for balance. He's a slightly tipsy Bacchus who doesn't seem to be able to keep his balance without the little satyr that he's leaning on. Then the face doesn't look off aloofly, elegantly, unperturbedly into the distance. He looks at his glass of wine with his head down and his eyes up. The eyes are shown as unfocused. He's a little bit drunk. And what's more, all the wine drinking of the god of wine has not left him without a mark. Look at the softness of the belly that Michelangelo adds to this figure. Michelangelo, 21 years old, dares to do something that people don't do. He makes fun of these Roman gods. He shows that he knows exactly how the Greco-Romans produced these sculptures, and he can do one above. He shows you the more real frat boy Bacchus than the ancient Romans idealized Bacchus. Now, Cardinal Riario didn't want the work, he rejected it, but several other Romans realized what an incredibly remarkable thing they add there. a young man who had tremendous talent, as is evident, and is willing to think out of the box. And so for that reason, Michelangelo got his first major commission for St. Peter's. In 1497, when he was given this commission, St. Peter's looked like this. This was before the reconstruction that was done by Bramante under Julius II. And the first commission for the Pietà was supposed to be placed in this small round room. It was going to be in its own private chapel. It was commissioned by the banker Jacopo del Gallo, who was the one who eventually purchased the Bacchus, and he is the one who negotiated the commission for Cardinal Bière de l'Aigrula, who was planning on being buried in that chapel and wanted a funerary decoration of the Pietà. And so Michelangelo's Pietà began in 1497 when Michelangelo was 23 years old. He was delivered a block of marble. And the only problem here is that no Italian had ever carved the Pietà before. The Pietà is not in the Bible. The scene of Mary holding Jesus before burial is not a scene known, not written in any of the Gospels. It was invented by the Germans, who also invented the image of the Pietà. And so this Pietà on the right, the Rüttingen Pietà from 1300, shows you why the Germans like this story. It's a way for us to feel pietà, to feel pity, to feel sorry for Mary and Jesus. So Mary sits very upright. We see her face, this face that is so distraught with sadness. But it's the body of Jesus that transfixes us in the German Pietà, because it's emaciated, because it's evidently tortured, because the wounds are carved out of the side with drops of blood carved out and painted red, with every sinew in the body stretched out in rigor mortis, with the crown of thorns still around his head. We look at this work, we have a visceral reaction. We're aware of Jesus' physical suffering, and we are invited to feel sorry for that torture that he underwent. That's not really the way Michelangelo is going to look at it. Michelangelo is going to filter this story through the eyes of the Italian peninsula, a much more elegant way of looking at the Pietà. He has one little precedent in Florence. Perugino had painted a Pietà, not sculpted, but painted. And you can see already that Perugino, like the Florentines, Ghiberti before him, they doesn't want to emphasize the wounds of Jesus's body. So he plays down the wounds. You can see them, but they aren't very marked. The body is much more elegant, as if it were sleeping. But still, Perugino maintains that awkwardness of the body stretched across Mary's lap. And so you have the head by John, the feet by Mary Magdalene, Mary's in the middle, and Jesus looks like an altar table. He looks like the actual physical altar that would have been underneath this work. Why was Michelangelo's Pietà so new? Because first of all, the way he rendered the human body. Michelangelo drew together the fact that he spent his time in Florence dissecting bodies. He knew about human anatomy, how the cartilage and the muscles and the bones move underneath the skin. And in doing so, he's able to give us a very poignant view of a lifeless body. But he doesn't just focus on the lifelessness. He also added that elegance that we were just talking about, that beautiful proportion and the beautiful articulation, which he didn't do for the Bacchus. He adds to the body of Jesus, really borrowing from the beautiful Apollo Belvedere, which was a very famous statue in Rome already in 1500. The other thing he did was he disregarded the rules of proportions in art. The Renaissance is all about proportion. When we talk about the beginning of the Renaissance, it's inextricable from the question of perspective. What is perspective? Linear perspective is the way of arranging figures in space in a harmonious, proportionate way. Everything the Renaissance worked on was to create order, harmony, proportion in art. And yet when Michelangelo makes the body of Jesus in the Pietà, he changes the proportions. Ercole de Roberti does a very beautiful version of a Pietà where he has Mary holding Jesus in her, she's sitting on the tomb, she's holding Jesus in her lap. And even though Mary is a sort of a large, dark clump, Jesus's body is evidently very long and large. We see it's a 6-foot tall man inside his mother's arms. may fudge a little bit around the bottom, but it's very, very clear that Jesus's body is a large one. Here we have a very funny series of proportions where Mary's upper body is proportionate to that of Jesus, but her lower body is not. Her lower body is enormous, as are her hands, by the way. And this lower body allows Jesus not to stretch across like an altar table, which is what happens in the right, but allows Jesus's body to be enfolded into her lap. So we think of Jesus in this relationship is all it draws to mind all the times we've seen the infant Christ on his mother's lap. So this Pietà alters the proportions of Mary so that Jesus looks small and vulnerable, and it makes us think of all those times Mary held her little boy in her arms as she holds him one more time. And this is another way, a very special way of drawing out that pathos or that pietà. The final thing he did was he engaged the viewer, and the Renaissance grows increasingly interested in involving the viewer in the scene. And so when Michelangelo produces his Pietà, he makes a very aggressive step towards involving the viewer. It's interesting to see that Ghirlandaio on the left-hand side really seems to have set the stage for Michelangelo, even though Michelangelo always says he never learned anything from Ghirlandaio. I think it's good to take that with a grain of salt. Look at this body of Jesus here, was being dumped onto the altar. And so you see that kind of body coming down, the weight of his hips coming down first. Everybody is participating in dropping him onto, there's a physical altar directly underneath it. So we see the body of Jesus being brought to the altar just in time for the Mass, and that moment of consecration when the Pope, when the priest says, "This is my body, which will be given up for you." And Michelangelo does the same thing. The body of Jesus is placed on Mary's lap. Mary's lap is very large, and yet the weight of Jesus's body is projected forward. You can see it's all on a little fold of cloth towards the front. Mary holds him with one hand, and the other hand is reaching out in a gesture of offering, and the body of Jesus looks like he's going to fall off her lap and land on the altar below. So this way of involving the viewer in the scene is extremely new. The sculpture is an extraordinary success. It was put into place for the Jubilee year of 1500, and it was so successful that when he returned to Florence, he was Florence's triumphing son. He had gone to Rome, he had shown those Romans, he had out-ancient Romans, the Roman sculptors. He had really produced a work to make Florence proud, and they asked him what they could do to put him in conditions to do something that magnificent for his own home city. And Michelangelo made an unusual request. He asked for a block of marble that had already been purchased. He didn't ask for a new block. There was a very large old block sitting in the Florentine cathedral. It was about 17 feet tall, but it was very narrow. It was probably going to be used for a sculpture that would be attached to the wall of the cathedral. And it was begun by a man named Agostino di Duccio, who, in his fervor to create the work, had carved a hole through the lower part of the marble, basically dictating where the legs were going to go. It had been sitting in the courtyard for about 40 years because no one knew what to do with it. It's a big piece of marble, it's valuable, but you needed a very skilled sculptor to know how to make a figure out of it. And so Michelangelo requested the sculpture, and in the 3 years, he carved the famous David. Now, this David is, again, like the Pietà, something no one had ever seen before. Michelangelo took a subject matter that had been done many, many times before, and he changed it in such a way that it would never be the same. When Donatello did David, he showed us a David building on the part of the story where the youthful David, who's been out tending sheep, is the son of Jesse, a young man, could never have possibly defeated the enormous Goliath, who's enormously tall, seasoned fighting man. And so Donatello used as a model ancient sculptures of these Cupid type figures, these sort of little adolescent, soft, elegant figures. As a matter of fact, the theme behind Donatello's David is the idea of the conquering of love. And so we look at a boy who could barely hold up that sword, and we realize it was only because of divine assistance that David was able to conquer Goliath. A few years later, Verrocchio, the teacher of Leonardo and Perugino, who we talked about last week, he took a stab, if you will, at making a David. And his David is wiry and strong. He's clearly all sinew and energy, the sharp thrust of the elbow, the sword sticking out at an angle. We have an energetic, a kinetic David who's willing to go out there and fight Goliath. But again, the sculpture is 4 feet tall and that figure is quite skinny. And so you realize that, again, despite all the energy that David will bring to the battle, it will take divine assistance to help David. Now, the problem is this. Michelangelo's David is 17 feet tall and weighs 6 tons. So the first question is, how big is Goliath? And so when we're talking about the duel between the seasoned Philistine, who is a professional fighter, gigantic among men, and then Michelangelo makes David already so ridiculously large and formidable, the problem is going to be how to express the vulnerability of David as he faces Goliath. And there are 2 things Michelangelo does in this work, completely new, but that are also key to this
vulnerability.
The first is the moment he chose of the scene. In the case of Donatello and Verrocchio, it is it's after the battle. Every artist up until Michelangelo showed David after the battle. He's standing with the head of Goliath. He's standing on the head of Goliath, near the head of Goliath, holding the sword. He's been triumphant. Battle's done. Michelangelo will always be the moment before guy. He chose to show us moments before David steps into the arena. He's standing off the stage or off to the side. He's looking towards the arena where he's about to step out. He's holding the stone in his hand and the slingshot over his shoulder and that wrinkle in his brow as he prepares himself psychologically. All the tension in this work is interior. The taut stomach, the wrinkled brow, as he's preparing that moment before he goes out there and starts this battle. So we get this maximum amount of internal energy. The second thing he did is that even though we look at that David and we think what a beautiful work, what a magnificent carving of the human body and a brilliant anatomical drawing, after a little while, you begin to realize there are a couple funny things about David. So that his head is definitely too big, so are his hands. His arms are extremely long. His chest is a little bit narrow. His legs are also a little long. The proportions of David are a little bit funny. They are certainly not the proportions of the Apollo Belvedere. They are the kinds of proportions that would have left a Greek sculptor looking at this work somewhat perplexed. He probably would have gone to Piero Soderini, the head of the Florentine Republic, and say, did you pay that guy to make the sculpture? Because he doesn't know anything about sculpting. So Michelangelo broke the cardinal rule of Greek art. He changed all the proportions. And there are many different theories for why this may be, but I will propose to you what I believe and what a handful of art historians believe, is that the way he shows David's vulnerability is to show him as an adolescent. David will grow into a great hero. He will be the magnificent king of Israel, composer of the Psalms. He's hugely important in the history of salvation. But the 16-year-old boy who went out to fight Goliath wasn't there yet. So we see the stature, we see the potential, but he's still growing into that potential. An incredibly brilliant way of observing the power and the glory of David, but still that awkwardness of adolescence folded into the scene, and completely innovative. And imagine when Raphael showed up in Florence, there was a committee meeting. There was Leonardo da Vinci, Filippino Lippi, a series of the Florentines' most established citizens are deciding where to put this statue, because they're certainly not going to stick it way up high on the cathedral where no one's going to see it. And I'm fairly certain Michelangelo never intended it to go up there. And they're deciding where can it go for the greatest prominence. And Raphael would have shown up in Rome shortly, if not at the moment, David was being hauled into his place in the Piazza della Signoria, which would be a few years before, and then later on it'll be moved to the Academia. So you see Raphael coming out into the big square in front of the city hall, looking up at that amazing statue and realizing that Florence really is the artistic big leagues. And as such, he realized something very important at the age of 20, 21, that trying to compete with Michelangelo's complete flouting of the ancient artistic rules and total focus on the human body was a waste of time. Why would he try to dog the footsteps of someone who really had this supreme talent and had single-minded focus on the human body? But then, after all, painting does not consist in only representing the nude human form. And so it has a wider field. And so being able to represent historical inventions well and with ease, this is where he would go, to learn how to add just the right amount of detail of nature, of clothing, of animals, of setting, of architecture, just the right amount to be able to draw out and frame the stories that he would tell. Raphael would become the artist who took an interest in everything in the created world, orchestrating them together to tell stories in his own inimitable way. And this willingness to engage with everything is what made Raphael a painter of, this is my favorite phrase when we talk about Raphael, a painter of Catholic excellence. Catholic in the sense of universal openness to everything. But that doesn't mean there was not a lot to learn from Michelangelo as Raphael was starting out. One of the things that he was in Florence for was the display of the Bruges Madonna before it took off to Belgium. The Bruges Madonna is the only work of Michelangelo to be commissioned to be sent out of the country. And for the Florentines took their art very seriously, took their artists very seriously. And so works of art were generally put on display so that other artists, as well as the Florentine citizens, could learn or enjoy them. So when Michelangelo carved the Bruges Madonna, he does a variant on the Pietà. Again, we see Jesus in Mary's lap, kind of contained between her knees. It's a very prophetic type of image. Baby Jesus holds his mother's hand, which is poignant and very sweet, but he's taking this first step forward. You see the bent knee and the foot coming forward, and he looks down sort of tentatively. We're looking at the infant Christ leaving his mother's arms to take his first steps, but we also connect that with Jesus's steps as he goes on his mission, which ultimately leads to his death on Calvary. Mary, again, beautiful, proud figure. She stands beautifully erect. This great work of drapery around her face, so it creates the shadow, which we also saw in the Pietà. She looks solemnly ahead of Jesus. She's seen almost like a prophetess here, where she's looking ahead, knowing that these first steps will eventually lead to these final steps, which will be so heartbreaking for her. So it's a sort of a solemn scene as opposed to a merry scene. And Raphael sees the brilliance of the composition, but he changes it into something more user-friendly. We've talked about this with Leonardo. Leonardo does these magnificent innovations in the Mona Lisa, but it's not necessarily a portrait that one would really want to have of one's wife or one's daughter or one's self, if one were a woman. Raphael's able to translate those ideas of the Mona Lisa into works that are a little bit more friendly for households. And that's also what he can do with Michelangelo. He takes this motif of the child Jesus between Mary's knees and he plays with it, creating these nice sort of equilateral triangle compositions where you see this sort of nice pyramid of Mary in the distance. You see a harmonious background, so you don't see not so much a feeling of the future trouble, but just a sense of this peaceful moment in the Holy Family. In the Madonna del Prato, Jesus turns to play with John the Baptist. So we have an intimate moment between the two cousins. And in the Madonna del Cardellino, which is a little bit more virtuoso, the child Jesus leans back, but reaches out to pet the little bird, which is again a symbol of his future passion. You'll notice that the foreground is freckled with pretty little flowers and leaves, and there's a sort of a happy little plant life, some poppies in the Madonna del Prato to create something of a natural, peaceful, pretty scene, which is not something Michelangelo is interested in. Raphael had two other very interesting opportunities to study the art of Michelangelo, and these are very, very special opportunities. These are works that went into people's houses. So basically, Michelangelo produced the works, he sent them over to the patrons, and Raphael turns out to work for the same patrons and has the opportunity to see the works. So the Taddei Tondo is being produced for the Taddei family, for whom Raphael also worked. This is a wealthy family in Florence. And again, one of the hallmarks of Florentine patronage is that it's really not just the Medicis. There are a great many successful families who have a lot of different tastes in art. So we have the Taddei, we have the Donis, we have the Strozzi, the Tornabuoni, the Rucellai, all these different families, all commissioning art, were part of what made a competitive milieu for artists. So they had to always bring out their best, but it also allows them to learn from each other because there's so many different things and approaches going on. It was a very, very, very special period in the history of art. At any rate, a tondo is a very specific type of work, which means it was supposed to be in someone's house. So as opposed to altarpieces, is what we've been looking at, a tondo is a round painting, which comes from the custom in Florence of when a woman would have a child, they would bring a round platter filled with sweets or fruits or foods or something. And eventually the idea was that this platter would be decorated. So after the food was consumed, the platter would remain as a souvenir. Then the platters themselves just graduated into works of art that are round. They almost invariably show the Madonna and Child and Joseph or John or some other infant scene of Christ, again, alluding to the fact that they're supposed to be gifts for the delivery of a child. Michelangelo, as you can imagine, he decided to do his tondo in marble. This is generally something that was painted, but Michelangelo made an effort at creating a carved tondo. He actually did two. There's another one in the Bargello. You see the Madonna who is turning away from, you see the Madonna who's holding Jesus. She's actually quite a lovely figure. She's reclining on one arm. This is drawn from ancient Roman sarcophagi again. And then John is occupying the opposite side. So the main part of the figure is occupied by the Madonna and John. And then baby Jesus gives the dynamism to the figure, seeming to curl away from whatever it is that John is showing. And maybe it was another little bird. This time Jesus seems to pull away into the safety of his mother's arms, but looks back towards John and whatever, the work is incomplete, whatever it is that John was showing him. And again, it becomes a scene that has a sense of a theological depth of Jesus foreshadowing his mission, almost that moment in the garden when he asks for the chalice to be taken away from him, but not my will, but thy will be done. Whereas Raphael takes that really clever positioning of the child and he turns it into something intimate and lovely to look at. Jesus doesn't look away towards John. Mary looks at Jesus and Jesus looks at Mary. The child stretched across her lap reaches up to play with her veil. There's a wonderful sense of warmth and intimacy and domesticity. We see this Madonna and Child. Yes, he's stretched out across her lap, and we can almost begin to pick up that idea of the motif of the body lying of the Pietà. But really, in that particular moment, we have a sweetness, a gentleness, something that is a joy and a pleasure to gaze upon. The most important exposure that Raphael has to Michelangelo's art in a private setting is inside the home of the Doni family. On the left is Agnolo Doni, on the right is Maddalena Strozzi, his wife, again, very successful business people in Florence who commissioned Raphael to do their portraits. And last week we talked about the portrait of Maddalena Strozzi from the point of view of how Raphael adapts the art of adapts the art of Leonardo with the hands in the portrait, with the three-quarter portrait, but he adapts it in such a way that it will be more more desirable or more marketable to wealthy businessmen. While he was producing these portraits in 1504 in the house of the Strozzi, it turns out, Doni, in the house of the Doni, turns out that Michelangelo has just delivered his famous Doni Tondo. Maddalena Strozzi had had her firstborn heir, and as a result, they commissioned of Michelangelo his one and only painted panel. And this, called the Doni Tondo, is Michelangelo's version of these round paintings meant to celebrate childbirth. Well, Michelangelo does things a little bit differently. His Pietà doesn't have the usual scenery. It doesn't have the usual flecks of gold. So let's take a look at the most famous Tondo painter in Florence in that era. Here we have Sandro Botticelli, who fills an entire room of the Uffizi with his magnificent Tondi. His Madonna of the Magnificat, extremely large, probably the most famous of all. Delicate gold gilding on the hair of the angels. The nature in the background, the little river leading off to the hills, the delicate golden crown, the diaphanous veils, the beautiful scarf around Mary's head, this incredible richness of decoration from her chair to the hem of her robe, to everything about it is just a joy, a luxurious, ornate, beautiful joy to behold. Michelangelo drops all the gold gilding. He even drops all the fancy color choices. As a matter of fact, half of his painting uses virtually no color whatsoever. The most simply applied color imaginable. We have a light blue blob in the background, which I trust is supposed to be hills. And then there's an expanse of a light green, which I think is supposed to be some kind of field. And then we have a series of 5 figures. So Sandro Botticelli puts 5 angels in the background here. They're all playing around, singing or watching. And Michelangelo gives us 5 figures who are probably not angels, but instead are represented as 5 nudes, which of course is Michelangelo's specialty, the rendering of the human body. There's been a lot of interpretation of what those nudes may mean. The one that I tend to think is the most interesting or thought-provoking is that these 5 figures look an awful lot like ancient statues, and that Michelangelo is looking at the problem of beauty as seen by the ancient Reed pagan world versus the problem of beauty seen by the Christian world. And these 5 beautiful, beautiful figures are completely self-absorbed. You'll notice that they're all looking at each other. They're all playing around with each other. And so that the beauty of the ancient world is something that's contained in and of itself, beauty that's really beauty for beauty's sake, as it were. And it's a very nice interpretation, although I will also tell you that, in my opinion, the reason why you have the 5 bodies there is that they are the substitute for trees. For everybody else who puts some trees or nature in the background, Michelangelo, who's not terribly interested in trees, puts in these 5 figures that serve the same purpose of blocking the background as if it were some sort of natural landscape, together with their broad stone ledge. As we move closer to ourselves, as the painting comes closer to us, we see little John the Baptist. Was a very interesting figure because he's born in the Old Testament, but he's looking towards the New Testament. And so you see him coming out of the world. He's looking beyond the pagan world towards the true beauty that comes into the world, which is, of course, Christ. And the colors accelerate when you get to, or the colors ignite when you get to the central figures. You see Joseph in yellow and blue, and the yellow, which is right underneath Jesus, is this luminosity and this light that's coming into the world. Baby Jesus all knotted up. He's like a little spring. It's this anticipation, again, waiting for this moment to happen. He's stepping forward. And Mary, one of the most extraordinary figures of this period, her knees projecting towards us as her body turns backwards to take her son. And this figure, which is like an unresolved chord, as you look at it, you expect that baby Jesus to be taken by Mary, and then to resolve that position, she will come around and bring that child right to the foreground, which is right to us. The way the arm stretches across the space will become a signature in Michelangelo's art. You'll see it many times in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And these knees that project towards you show a man who has really mastered how to represent the human body so that bucando la pagina, it's punching a hole in the page, and really a very, very striking work, which Raphael had the opportunity to study at close quarters during his time working for the Doni. Now, I'd like to interrupt my discussion of Raphael and Michelangelo for just one more figure who I do think is very important about Raphael's Florentine experience. His name is Fra Bartolomeo. His real name was Baccio della Porta. And as you can see, he was only 3 years older than Michelangelo. So we're dealing with this gap in age. Michelangelo was 8 years older. We have Fra Bartolomeo, who's 11 years older. Leonardo da Vinci is 30 years older. So it's a very different relationship. Now, Michelangelo probably didn't even notice Raphael was in Florence. He was very, very busy doing his own thing. Yet another young artist trying to make his mark, probably did not, painter on top of that, probably did not even register on Michelangelo's radar. At least we have no account of Michelangelo and Raphael meeting. But we do have an account of Raphael meeting this Fra Bartolomeo. And the reason why Fra Bartolomeo is also a lovely figure is because a few years later in 1516, Michelangelo and Fra Bartolomeo will work on a project together. And I just think it's lovely to have this little portrait sketch, a quick pen sketch. It's the equivalent of a digital camera, a quick pen sketch by Fra Bartolomeo of Michelangelo. So this is my favorite image of Michelangelo because it's what he looked like. It's not the studio portrait. It's not the idealized portrait. It's his friend who was watching him at work one day and just took down a quick sketch of the master. But I digress. Fra Bartolomeo, his personal biography is very important. As you can see, again, born in 1472, he was about 30 years old when he was almost 30, when he had a massive religious conversion. This was due principally to the preaching of Girolamo Savonarola. And in this conversion, he decided to join the Dominican order. So basically, from 1500 to 1504, Fra Bartolomeo had left his life as a painter. He was off studying to become a Dominican. And in 1504, he emerges from this period of preparation. He is now a Dominican friar. And the Dominicans ask him, instead of being a preacher, because they're the order of preachers, instead of preaching from the pulpit, they ask him to continue painting. So he will be a preacher in paint. Fra Bartolomeo, at this exact moment, met Raphael and they became friends. And the idea is, when Giorgio Vasari describes it, is that Raphael learned about color from Fra Bartolomeo, and that Fra Bartolomeo learned about proportion or perspective. So that the idea is that they had a sort of a working relationship where they taught each other. I think a little bit more is going on here. I think it's very important that Raphael learn some sort of foundation in understanding how to transmit sacred stories. And so we have Fra Bartolomeo, who's been preparing for 4 years to become a preacher. He befriends a young and brilliant artist. And I think Fra Bartolomeo, who's already alive with the faith, all he wants to do is evangelize, is the one who is helping Raphael to figure out how to engage with religious subject matters. A very important passage before he comes to Rome. He has to be able to think independently and understand sacred stories, something that Michelangelo has had ever since the garden in Florence. Raphael most likely began to really get up to speed through his relationship with Fra Bartolomeo. And you see the two of them side by side. You see the Cambi altarpiece that was done for San Marco in Florence, which is where Fra Bartolomeo was living. And Raphael, who is building on this idea, especially the adorable angels flying around in the heavens, and the mobile canopy that covers the Madonna and Child with the standing figures in the sacred conversation. Raphael's understanding of how to create the space is obviously superior. He's got these beautiful Corinthian columns and a coffered semidome. And then, of course, the kind of cute aspect of Raphael is always there, as you have the two angels in the foreground who are sort of looking at a scroll together. This is going to be kind of a signature Raphael often adds sweet elements, whereas Fra Bartolomeo is a little bit more serious and grounded. And this brings me to a very important moment in the restoration work of the Vatican museums. As it just so happens, in 1514, Raphael, who is in Rome working for now Leo X, brings down Fra Bartolomeo, they work together one more time. 10 years later, they work together one more time. Raphael paints St. Peter, Fra Bartolomeo paints St. Paul. It is evident that in those years, Raphael's skills in painting have really exponentially increased. The beauty of that St. Peter, the way that burnished metal of the key, the blue, that lapis blue of Peter's robe, almost that shadowy expression, the way the light hits the corner of his face. Raphael has really become an exceptional painter. Fra Bartolomeo's painting is still quite lovely. Paul stands with his arm extending out of the niche, standing on top of the column. It's a fine, fine figure. But Raphael's constant learning really shows in 1514 when they do this work together. And these two paintings, which are found in the Apostolic Palace, occasionally if you ever see paintings of the Holy Father meeting people, sometimes these two are in the background. They are under restoration right now, even as we speak, in the Vatican Restoration Lab. So we'll have something to look forward to when these re-emerge from their conservation work. So Raphael takes that knowledge that he has learned from Michelangelo and he brings it to bear in this work, which I showed you last week and I'm showing you this week, because it is in the history of art, the work that art historians believe showed Raphael's readiness to come to Rome. And last week we looked at the entombment painted in Perugia for Atlanta Baioni in 1507. We looked at it from the point of view of what did he learn from Leonardo? And the poignancy of the hand of Mary and the hand of Jesus, the empathetic connection between the lifeless face of Christ and the fainting face of Mary, the juxtaposition of the man's face who's straining to carry Jesus and Jesus's lifeless face. This is all out of the Leonardo playbook. But there are elements in this work that also come from Michelangelo, most obviously that arm of Jesus, which falls out of the shroud and is evidently a copy of Michelangelo's Pietà. It's a quotation of Michelangelo's Pietà, which was known very well through drawings. There's also this remarkable figure of Matthew. Michelangelo had been working on a statue of Saint Matthew in Florence when he left. Raphael had the opportunity of seeing how to make a figure occupy very little space and yet have a lot of dynamism. And you can see this is the figure in the green and the yellow is clearly an opposite. It's like a mirror image of Michelangelo's Matthew. And of course, the Doni Tondo gave us this amazing young woman over on the right-hand side whose knees project forward as she reaches back to catch the fainting Mary. So Raphael is bringing together what he's learned from Raphael, what he's learned from Michelangelo. It's like the ultimate comp exam for a master's or a PhD, showing that he can take these ideas and produce a work of art that nonetheless would never be mistaken for Michelangelo nor for Leonardo. Now, in doing this, he does stick his neck out. This is a very complicated scene to try to represent, and therefore there are a couple errors. One is in the figure of Matthew here again, the yellow and the green. The upper part of the body and the lower part of the body cannot possibly be connected. Whereas on the right, the figure of the female figure kneeling forward is the legs, the thighs are too long. The proportions of Raphael are off. And even though these things, they kind of stand out a little bit if you look at the painting for a while, what they really meant to art connoisseurs in 1708, 1507, was that Raphael was ready to take the kinds of risks, ready to go out on a limb, ready to think out of a box, ready to be brave enough to have to make a mistake and have to correct it, because these are all very correctable mistakes. He's ready to come to Rome. because he's ready to take chances, which is exactly what Julius II is looking for in 1506, when he starts thinking about how he wants his tomb built, how he wants his church built, how he wants his apartments decorated. This man, that Pope, is ready to take risks, and Raphael is therefore ready to join that court. And so he comes to Rome, and he comes, and an interesting thing he does is he gets interested in poetry. And I think we talked about how with Leonardo da Vinci, painting and sculpture were not considered liberal arts. But poetry is considered a liberal art. And as a matter of fact, this famous line, which goes all the way back to ancient Roman poetry, I think it's Horace, ut pictura poesis, is the more that painting resembles poetry, the better it is, or the more that poetry resembles painting. So poetry is painting pictures with words. Painting is making poems with pictures. And so basically, these artists who are interested in entering the realm of the liberal artists, they get involved in poetry. Michelangelo has a lifetime of poetry. Michelangelo, we have entire books of his sonnets, and some of them are really quite moving and beautiful. Raphael got interested in poetry. Remember, his father was the one who wrote the rhymed chronicle, naming all the great artists of the age. But Raphael's 3 known poems are basically love poems. So these poems are written at the exact same time. It's 1509, and he's talking about, you know, this love story with yet another beautiful woman, which, of course, in the other episodes we hear Raphael was not indifferent to female beauty. And Michelangelo in 1509 was painting in the Sistine Chapel and writing what I don't think he intended this to be his most famous poem, but it is, in which he complains from beginning to end about all of the physiological consequences of painting the Sistine Chapel while standing up. And as a matter of fact, in the original, you see the caricature of Michelangelo painting the ceiling. It's just interesting to see that in the same year, both men are producing poems. They're writing poetry. They're expressing themselves in another artistic outlet. But the fact of the matter is they are very different men. Raphael already grew up in an artistic studio, and he understands to do the kind of work he needs to do and the kind of busyness and the kind of demand that he will have. He needs a team. And so Raphael begins to assemble around him a larger and larger team. You heard in one of our episodes, he had the largest studio of the Renaissance, whereas Michelangelo seemed to work very much alone. He didn't have a school. He had few regular companions. Most of the time you saw him kind of marching off on his own. And we don't have a lot of stories of the encounters between Michelangelo and Raphael, but we have one recorded that is particularly funny, where apparently Raphael with his entourage was walking along and ran into Michelangelo, who was alone. And Michelangelo apparently couldn't resist saying something silly like, "Why are you always surrounded by people like some kind of court jester?" And Raphael answered, "Well, why are you always alone, like an executioner?" So again, we don't really get the feeling of these two guys who got along famously and were swapping beers after work at the end of the day. They really were superstars, however. They were already evidently superstars. Raphael had really cut his teeth. Michelangelo, ever since the Pietà, had already been famous, let alone the David. They were duking it out for their respective arts. Raphael is a painter, and he takes the place of Leonardo before him, working as an adversary to Michelangelo to show the superiority of painting, that painting should be a liberal art. Michelangelo is there to show the superiority of sculpture, that should be the liberal art. So we have many things at play here. We have these two arts that are clashing, and then what makes the story irresistible are the two completely different personalities. Raphael, who the Zari tells us everybody who spent time with Raphael was a better person for it. He was good at working at a team, hardworking, congenial, easy to be around. I like to think of him as the Tom Hanks of the Renaissance world. Whereas Michelangelo, intense, very personally involved in each one of his projects, something more of a loner. I tend to see more as the Robert De Niro in the history of the Renaissance. And so with these two superstars, these two great, remarkable personalities, all I have to say is that we are very fortunate to live in an age where we have such brilliant actors as Tom Hanks and Robert De Niro to bring stories alive to us, just as we are very fortunate to be able to have the legacy of this age, which brought men like Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo together to produce works of art that still bring us delight, still help us think, still inspire us, still make us want to be better people today. And I thank you, Asian patrons, for this wonderful experience of these 4 encounters together, especially during such trying times. It's been a joy to be able to get together and talk about beauty, talk about hope, talk about the best that human beings can be and can do despite their foibles with you. And I look forward to seeing you in Rome and looking at these beautiful works together.